somehow hollow and fundamentally incomplete. So Aemond eventually made a genuinely fateful decision. He would personally leave King's Landing behind and hunt Daemon down himself, flying Vhagar extensively across the sprawling Riverlands region in relentless pursuit. It seemed, at least on paper, like a perfectly sound overall strategy. Eliminate the Black's single most capable general and dragon rider, and the remainder of the rebellion might well collapse entirely on its own. But the plan itself required stripping the capital entirely of its single greatest defender at precisely the moment its watchful enemies were actively searching for exactly such an opening to exploit. Daemon, being the genuine master of misdirection that he had always been, made absolutely certain that Aemond never actually managed to catch him. Weeks gradually turned into an increasingly maddening chase across the Riverlands, a fleeting sighting here, an unconfirmed rumor there, always frustratingly just out of reach, while Aemond's growing personal obsession deepened steadily, and his overall attention to his official duties as protector of the realm withered away almost completely. And while he continued chasing elusive shadows through burned-out villages and abandoned riverside towns, Rhaenyra's own forces, quietly gathering renewed strength back at Dragonstone, recognized their emerging opportunity and struck decisively. Under cover of complete darkness, with several sympathetic lords opening the city gates from within, King's Landing fell to the advancing Blacks with barely any organized resistance offered at all. Alicent herself was taken prisoner. Aegon, still slowly recovering from his earlier injuries, was forced to flee the capital entirely. Rhaenyra herself finally sat down triumphantly upon the Iron Throne, wearing the very same crown that Aemond himself had been wearing only days earlier. Aemond ultimately learned of the capital's sudden fall not through any official raven, but instead from a single terrified messenger who eventually found him sheltering at a burned-out roadside in near the God's Eye Lake. He had been thoroughly outmaneuvered not through any superior strength, but rather through patience and genuine cunning, precisely the same qualities that Daemon had always possessed in considerably greater measure than himself. Every single false trail, every frustrating near-miss throughout the entire hunt, had been a deliberate, carefully calculated lure, and Aemond, thoroughly consumed by his own need for personal vengeance, had walked directly and willingly into the trap. He had effectively traded an entire kingdom for the satisfaction of a personal grudge, and still, even in that particular moment of total and complete humiliation, he flatly refused to turn back and beg anyone for acceptable terms. If he could no longer realistically hold the throne himself, he decided grimly, he could at the very least end the life of the man who had successfully taken it from him. Chapter 16: The Scorched Riverlands. With King's Landing now genuinely lost to the enemy, Aemond's ongoing campaign through the Riverlands region stopped being simply a targeted hunt, and instead became something considerably closer to outright collective punishment. If Daemon genuinely wished to keep hiding among the rivers and scattered ruins of the region, Aemond decided coldly, then he would personally burn every single reed and stone throughout the entire land, until his elusive uncle had absolutely nowhere left remaining to hide. Castle after castle that had previously declared loyalty for the Blacks soon saw Vhagar's unmistakable silhouette appear ominously on the horizon. Aemond offered no terms whatsoever and demanded no formal surrender from anyone. He simply arrived without warning and burned everything in sight. Wooden keeps became raging infernos within mere minutes of his arrival. Entire agricultural fields turned rapidly to ash and cinder. He extended this campaign of fire even to small villages and isolated farms that had no soldiers and no defensive walls whatsoever, reasoning coldly that the ordinary smallfolk who fed and sheltered Rhaenyra's ongoing rebellion were never truly innocent bystanders in his eyes, but rather represented the very soil from which that entire rebellion had originally grown. Desperate refugees clogged every available road heading south and east, fleeing from a devastation that seemed to possess absolutely no meaningful limit and no trace of genuine mercy. He eventually established his primary base of operations at Harrenhal, the enormous, famously cursed fortress originally built centuries earlier by a king so profoundly arrogant that he genuinely believed his massive stone walls could successfully withstand dragonfire itself. Aegon the Conqueror had proven that particular assumption catastrophically wrong generations earlier, and the castle's melted, permanently twisted towers had stood ever since as a lasting monument to that harsh historical lesson. The garrison previously holding the castle for the Blacks fled immediately the moment word arrived that Vhagar was actively approaching, leaving Aemond free to walk into entirely empty, eerily echoing halls that the local smallfolk swore were genuinely haunted by something considerably older and darker than mere ordinary ghosts. Chapter 17: The Witch of Harrenhal. It was within that specific cursed castle that Aemond first encountered a mysterious woman who would ultimately change the entire final chapter of his life. Her name was Alice Rivers, described variously as a skilled healer by some accounts, and as an actual witch by others, reportedly born somewhere within Harrenhal's own dark shadow, or perhaps even within its ancient walls themselves. Aemond first found her one night in an overgrown, weed-choked courtyard, kneeling quietly beside an old stone well, softly singing in some unfamiliar language he didn't personally recognize at all. She looked directly up at him as though she had somehow known all along that he was coming to find her. She was genuinely unlike anyone he had previously encountered at court. She did not visibly flinch at the sight of his scars, did not bow formally before his crown, and looked at him instead as though she could see straight through his skin toward whatever still burned quietly underneath. In a world that had consistently taught him to trust almost no one around him, that particular quality proved genuinely intoxicating. He began returning to speak with her night after night, and over the following weeks she gradually began offering him detailed visions, glimpses, she claimed, of specific ambushes yet to occur, of betrayals not yet formally committed, of dangers still quietly gathering somewhere out in the surrounding darkness. Several of her specific predictions proved eerily accurate when tested against subsequent events, and Aemond, hardened as he genuinely was by that point in his life, found himself trusting her judgment more and more with each passing week that went by. Rumors quickly spread throughout the assembled garrison that the Witch of Harrenhal had somehow bewitched their commanding prince, that she now regularly shared his private bed, that she might even currently be carrying his unborn child. Aemond never once confirmed any part of these persistent rumors, though he never explicitly denied them either. What does seem genuinely certain is that during his extended time at Harrenhal, something meaningful within him began to noticeably change. The scorched earth fury that had previously defined his entire military campaign gradually gave way, at least in private moments, to a strange, uneasy kind of stillness. He spoke openly to Alice about his own difficult childhood, about the specific night he had permanently lost his eye, about the full decade of accumulated hatred that had been steadily building in his chest ever since that formative night, and she listened attentively without ever passing judgment, offering him a genuine kind of comfort he had never once received at the royal court. Her visions grew noticeably darker as that particular winter deepened around them. She told him plainly and directly that the ongoing war would not ultimately end in victory for the Greens, that a terrible fire was steadily approaching that would eventually consume him utterly and completely, and that his own final battle would take place somewhere above a great lake. Aemond, who had spent his entire life up to that point refusing to visibly show fear of anything, did not simply dismiss her unsettling words outright. Perhaps the accumulated weight of everything he had personally done by that point, the burned villages, the murdered nephew, the heavy crown he had never genuinely wanted but still stubbornly refused to relinquish, had finally begun catching up with him in some deep, undeniable way. Chapter 18, The Duel Above the God's Eye. Rather than simply waiting passively for the grim fate that Alice had described to him, Aemond ultimately chose to meet it directly and head-on. From his base at Harrenhal, he sent Aemond Targaryen a direct, entirely unconditional formal challenge. A duel fought explicitly to the death, to take place above the God's Eye, the Great Lake sitting at the very heart of the Riverlands region. Aemond accepted this challenge without any visible hesitation whatsoever, arriving alone near the shores close to Harrenhal and then patiently waiting there for nearly 2 full weeks, a silent, entirely deliberate taunt that Aemond ultimately found impossible to simply ignore any longer. On the appointed morning, the 2 Targaryen princes finally met face to face on the muddy lakeshore, each one personally carrying the ancient fire of dragons within their own blood, each one representing absolutely everything the other man had come to genuinely despise about the opposing side of their own shared family. There were no lengthy speeches exchanged between them. Aemond simply told his uncle that he had traveled a very long way specifically to die. Aemond replied only that he had come personally to end things between them, one way or another. Then, without further words, they both mounted their respective dragons for what would prove to be the final time. Vhagar rose first into the sky, ancient, absolutely immense, moving through the open air with the slow, crushing inevitability of an entire continent gradually shifting. Caraxes followed close behind her, lean and distinctly serpentine, capable of a lethal aerial agility that seemed genuinely impossible for a creature of his considerable size. Where Vhagar represented a devastating hammer, Caraxes represented instead a precise, deadly blade, and in the skilled hands of a rider as brilliant and thoroughly desperate as Aemond, that particular blade consistently found its critical openings again and again throughout the ensuing battle. The 2 magnificent dragons collided violently high above the lake in what would become, without question, the single most infamous aerial duel in the entire recorded history of Westeros. Vhagar repeatedly attempted to close her powerful jaws around her opponent's exposed throat. Caraxes twisted skillfully away each and every time, raking his sharp claws across her vulnerable eye ridges, drawing dark, steaming blood that sprayed dramatically across the darkening evening sky. Villagers scattered for miles around looked up in genuine awe and saw two massive shapes locked tightly together high above the clouds, wreathed continuously in bursts of dragon flame that briefly lit the entire twilight sky like some kind of second sun. Eventually, in a devastating headlong collision that neither exhausted dragon proved able to successfully avoid, they locked together completely. Claws sunk brutally deep, powerful jaws clamped tightly around one another's straining flesh, and slowly began falling together toward the water below. It was during that final, chaotic spinning descent that Daemon did something genuinely unthinkable. He deliberately unfastened himself from his own secure saddle, carefully climbed along Caraxes' long spine, and then leapt directly onto Vhagar's own back, driving his ancestral Valyrian steel sword known as Dark Sister straight through Aemond's glowing sapphire eye and directly into his skull beneath it. Aemond died instantly upon impact, still strapped securely to his own saddle, never once actually seeing the fatal blow that finally ended a bitter hatred more than a full decade in the careful making. Mere moments later, the two now locked, mortally wounded dragons struck the surface of the god's eye with tremendous force, sending an enormous wall of displaced water shooting high up into the surrounding clouds above. When the lake's surface finally settled back down again, there was genuinely nothing left visible to see, no lingering fire, no floating wreckage, only still, dark water where two of the most dangerous men and two of the very last great dragons in all of Westeros had simply and completely vanished from sight forever. Chapter 19: What the Lake Kept. No one from either warring side managed to recover the bodies on that particular day. It was only several months later, deep in the depths of that harsh winter, that a group of river lords dragging the lake bottom in search of any salvageable weapons and armor finally discovered what remained of Vhagar resting at the very bottom, her enormous bones half buried within the thick mud, and still securely strapped to her long-rotted saddle, a complete human skeleton with visible strands of silver hair still clinging stubbornly to the exposed skull. The right eye socket remained entirely empty, exactly as it had been throughout his life. In the left socket, driven permanently deep into the surrounding bone, a single sapphire still gleamed faintly beneath the filtered underwater light. They carefully brought the recovered remains up to shore, genuinely uncertain what exactly they should do with them. This had been, after all, the infamous kinslayer Aemond One-Eye, the Prince Regent who had once proudly worn the Conqueror's own crown, the same boy who had lost an eye to a careless child's blow, and then plunged an entire kingdom into devastating war chasing the vengeance that inevitably followed. He had personally burned countless villages and widowed grieving mothers, flown proudly above the clouds while sending literally thousands of people to their premature graves, and now here he lay, reduced to a simple pile of bones, no more genuinely powerful in death than the smallest peasant who had died in one of the many fires he had personally set during his campaign. King's Landing itself demonstrated little genuine interest in properly honoring the remains of a man who had ultimately fought loyally for a king already dead by poison, under an entirely new boy king now being raised primarily among the blacks who personally owed his deceased uncle absolutely nothing at all. Aemond's recovered bones were quietly buried near the lake itself, far removed from the elaborate tombs of his royal ancestors, with no funeral songs sung in his honor and no memorial stone ever carved with his name upon it. The sapphire itself was eventually pried loose from the skull and sold to a traveling merchant from distant Bravos, who wore it afterward as a simple pendant until the day he himself drowned off the coast of Pentos, a small, strange, almost poetic echo of the very fate that had originally claimed the man to whom it once belonged. As for Alice Rivers herself, she vanished entirely from Harrenhal not long after the war's eventual conclusion. Some accounts claim she fled far away to the distant free cities. Others insist she instead remained quietly within the Riverlands as a genuine recluse, her prophecies reportedly growing steadily stranger and darker with advancing age. Whether the child rumored to be Aemond's own son ever truly existed at all, and precisely what eventually became of him if he genuinely did, remains one of the many unanswered mysteries that this terrible war left permanently behind it, a story with no confirmed ending, passed down informally from tavern to tavern over the generations more as enduring legend than as verified historical fact. Chapter 20: The Legacy of the One-Eyed Prince. Aemond Targaryen wanted, more than almost anything else in his entire life, to be genuinely remembered, to be properly feared, sincerely respected, and never again mocked the way he had once been as a helpless young boy holding a pig that had been cruelly dressed up to look like a dragon. In the end, he did manage to achieve a certain twisted version of that original goal. He is, without question, genuinely remembered to this day. But the ultimate price paid for that lasting memory turned out to be absolutely everything else he might have otherwise had. His entire family violently torn apart, a devastating war that thoroughly hollowed out an entire proud dynasty, a dragon's bare bones resting at the bottom of a forgotten lake, and one single word permanently attached to his name for the remainder of recorded history: Kinslayer. He was, in the end, the second son who genuinely wanted to be first, the boy who desperately wanted to become a real man, the rider who wanted more than anything to become truly one with his own dragon. He ultimately got his dragon. He got his war. He got the widespread fear he had always secretly craved throughout his difficult childhood. But he also became, in the process, living proof of something considerably darker, that a deep wound left to fester for long enough will eventually demand far more blood than it was ever originally owed, and that raw ambition, left entirely untempered by any genuine mercy, tends inevitably to consume the very thing it was originally meant to protect and preserve. The devastating war he personally helped ignite did not simply end with his own death above that lake. It continued grinding on for a while longer afterward, steadily consuming what little remained of both warring families, until the great dragons themselves, thoroughly worn down after decades spent fighting one another relentlessly, gradually began vanishing from the world entirely and permanently. Historians looking back on these events would often point specifically to one single moment as representing the true beginning of that final tragic ending. The terrible night above Storm's End, when Aemond first proved, for the very first time in generations, that kinslaying was not some unthinkable, sacred taboo after all, but rather simply another available tactic within a larger war being fought over raw political power. Once that particular line had been crossed openly, it could genuinely never be uncrossed again by anyone. Tonight, we leave him exactly where his story has always ultimately left him, not enshrined within the triumphant songs of traveling bards or the celebratory pages of victorious history, but instead resting quietly in the cold, undisturbed earth beside a still dark lake, his bones now separated forever from the ancient beast he once bravely tamed as a frightened, furious boy of only 10 years old. The long war is finally over. The great dragons are entirely gone from the world. And the one-eyed prince who once wanted so desperately to burn brighter than anyone else in his entire troubled family has, at long last, and quite permanently, finally been laid properly to rest. Personally reaffirmed Rhaenyra's rightful claim to the Iron Throne on his very deathbed. But within mere hours of his passing, Queen Alicent Hightower made a fateful decision that would ultimately ignite a devastating civil war rather than allow that particular claim to stand unchallenged. A small, carefully selected group of the most powerful men currently in the realm gathered together in complete secrecy, a body that history would eventually come to know formally as the Green Council. It included Otto Hightower, the Queen's own father and the reigning hand of the king, Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Grand Maester Orwell, Lord Larry Strong, and seated quietly at the far end of the long table with his distinctive sapphire eye catching the flickering candlelight, Prince Aemond Targaryen himself. There was in truth no genuine debate whatsoever over whether to properly honor the late king's final dying wish. That particular question, in the minds of everyone seated around that table, had effectively been settled years earlier already. The only real discussion that mattered now was precisely how to successfully crown Aegon before Rhaenyra, still safely away at distant Dragonstone, could possibly learn that her father was even dead yet. Aemond quickly became the primary enforcer of the entire hastily assembled plan. Though not yet even 20 years of age himself, he moved through King's Landing that critical night with remarkably cold efficiency. Quietly pressuring the sitting commander of the city watch into sealing every city gate and grounding all outgoing ravens, personally warning the keepers of the royal dragon pit, with Vhagar's massive shadow looming ominously over the stone tunnels as a distinctly unsubtle reminder of what was at stake, that he would not hesitate for even a moment to use her if it became necessary. And personally helping to confine the castle's various servants so that no premature word of the king's death could possibly slip out before the planned coronation could be completed. Aegon himself, the genuinely reluctant heir to everything now unfolding, was eventually located hiding in a disreputable flea-bottom brothel, forcibly dragged back to the Red Keep, and given a crown he had apparently never particularly wanted for himself. There, in a hastily organized ceremony that skipped over nearly every traditional formality expected on such an occasion, he was formally crowned as King Aegon II, wearing the ancient conqueror's crown originally belonging to Aegon the Dragon himself. Aemond stepped forward deliberately, drew his sword in one smooth motion and knelt formally before his own brother, declaring himself the new king's personal shield and sword while solemnly swearing to guard his brother's reign with fire and blood if necessary. It was there in that specific moment that he was first given the formal title that would come to define much of the remainder of his life, Protector of the Realm. By the time the sun finally rose fully over King's Landing that following morning, the ordinary smallfolk woke to discover an entirely new king already ruling over them, with no memory whatsoever of the old king's recent passing. Aemond understood clearly, even as the enthusiastic cheers of the Green Council slowly faded away around him, that this represented merely the opening move within a much larger conflict that would eventually consume absolutely everyone involved. Ravens would soon inevitably fly toward distant Dragonstone carrying the shocking news. Rhaenyra would almost certainly refuse to accept this hasty coronation as legitimate, and the terrible war that history would eventually call the Dance of the Dragons was about to begin in earnest at last. Chapter 10: Storm's End. A royal crown alone commands absolutely nothing without sufficient swords available to properly defend it, and in the tense days immediately following Aegon's hasty coronation, the assembled Green Council understood clearly that the entire outcome of the coming war might well hinge on which of the realm's great houses ultimately chose to answer their urgent call for support. Aemond, now formally recognized as Protector of the Realm, was quickly dispatched east across the choppy waters of Shipbreaker Bay toward the ancient fortress of Storm's End, tasked with personally securing the crucial loyalty of Lord Borrys Baratheon, and through him, the full military strength of the entire Stormlands region. He arrived not accompanied by any substantial army but almost entirely alone, riding directly on Vhagar's back, carrying with him a carefully prepared offer of marriage alliance specifically designed to permanently bind House Baratheon to the Green cause going forward. Lord Borrys, a genuinely proud man burdened with 4 daughters but no living sons of his own, listened carefully as Aemond methodically laid out the specific terms within the castle's great hall, howling wind battering steadily against the ancient stone walls surrounding them both. Before the delicate negotiation could be properly concluded, the heavy doors swung open once again and a second unexpected envoy arrived. Lucerys Velaryon, sent personally by his own mother Rhaenyra on that very same diplomatic errand, hoping to secure Storm's End instead for the Black Cause. The atmosphere within the hall changed instantly and dramatically. For the very first time in years, Aemond found himself standing directly face to face with the boy who had permanently taken his eye all those years earlier. He said nothing overtly crude and made no direct threats of any kind, but his voice, when he eventually spoke of old debts and blood still very much owed, carried within it a quiet, unmistakable menace that visibly unsettled absolutely everyone present in the hall. Lord Borrys, thoroughly unwilling to allow any actual bloodshed under the ancient, sacred laws of Gestrite that governed his own household, firmly refused to let either visiting prince harm the other while inside his walls, but he made unmistakably clear that he would offer Lucerys no further protection whatsoever once the boy eventually left the physical safety of the castle grounds. Lucerys had no real choice remaining but to depart, mounting his young dragon Caraxes and launching immediately into an already darkening, storm-heavy evening sky. Aemond followed closely behind him on Vhagar without speaking another single word. Chapter 11: The Kinslayer. What followed next above the churning sea near Storm's End became, without question, the single most consequential event of the entire ensuing war, the specific moment that would eventually earn Aemond the terrible name that history itself would never allow him to forget. At first, it may genuinely have been intended only as simple intimidation, a deliberate demonstration of raw physical power. An attempt to sufficiently frighten a boy who had wronged him years earlier into finally cowering before him. Vhagar represented an absolute mountain compared to Caraxes' considerably more slender, quicker frame, and the ensuing chase through the violent storm, lightning repeatedly splitting the darkened sky, driving rain lashing mercilessly at both young riders must have felt, from poor Lucerys' own perspective, remarkably similar to being actively hunted by something ancient, implacable, and entirely unstoppable. He never once turned back to face his pursuer directly. Perhaps he genuinely believed the raging storm itself might somehow conceal him from view. Perhaps he simply refused, out of pure stubborn pride, to visibly show fear in front of the uncle who had apparently hated him since early childhood. But somewhere within that desperate chase, simple intimidation transformed abruptly into something else entirely, whether by Aemond's own direct spoken command, or by some independent predatory instinct belonging entirely to Vhagar herself. Surviving historical accounts genuinely differ on this crucial point, and perhaps even Aemond himself was never fully certain afterward. The ancient dragon suddenly lunged forward with terrifying speed. Her massive jaws closed instantly around Caraxes, brutally crushing bone and sinew in a single devastating instant, and then came the fire, one single, terrible burst that briefly lit the surrounding storm clouds bright orange before the smaller dragon simply came apart entirely in midair. Lucerys never had even a moment's time to properly cry out. The dark, churning sea below swallowed whatever small remains eventually fell from the sky. Aemond hovered silently in place for one long, extended moment within the driving rain, staring fixedly at the empty space where his young nephew had been only seconds before. Whatever genuine satisfaction he might reasonably have expected to feel in that moment simply never actually arrived. This had not been any kind of fair battle fought between genuine equals. It had been, quite simply, the cold-blooded killing of an unarmed diplomatic messenger sent on a legitimate errand who also happened to be his own direct blood relative. The specific word used for that particular crime in every single corner of Westeros was kinslayer, and it attached itself to Aemond instantly and completely permanently, spoken from that day forward with roughly equal measures of genuine fear and open revulsion, from the Red Keep itself all the way to the farthest, coldest reaches of the distant north. He flew home again in complete silence, eventually landing entirely alone within the Red Keep's central courtyard just as dawn was breaking. Word of what had happened had already outtraced his own return flight. Alicent, emerging personally to meet her returning son, did not greet him with any visible sign of maternal pride, but instead with a weary, tightly controlled sorrow. She understood immediately and completely what this specific act genuinely meant for all of them going forward. The war would no longer remain simply a matter of competing legal claims and carefully managed political councils. It would now become, quite unavoidably, a matter of raw personal vengeance, and vengeance, once properly summoned into being, rarely ever limits itself conveniently to only a single settled account. Chapter 12: Blood and Cheese. News of Lucerys' violent death reached distant Dragonstone even before any official raven could properly carry the formal report, brought instead by a group of genuinely terrified local fishermen who discovered scattered wreckage washed ashore along the coastline. For Rhaenyra personally, this represented far more than simply the loss of a useful diplomatic ally or an unfortunate political setback. It was quite simply the death of her own beloved son, the second child she had now personally lost to this escalating war, killed in a manner that violated one of the very oldest and most sacred protections recognized throughout the entire Seven Kingdoms. The fundamental safety that any properly designated messenger is owed under the ancient laws of Gestright. Her grief curdled rapidly into something considerably colder within only a matter of days. Two men, a disgraced former city watchman known simply as Blood, and an experienced rat catcher known only as Cheese, were secretly dispatched directly into the heart of the Red Keep with one single, horrifying purpose clearly in mind: to make Aemond's own family feel precisely what Rhaenyra herself was now feeling. They ultimately found not Aemond personally, but rather his brother's own young children, specifically Helena's small twins. Under direct threat of immediate death, Helena was cruelly forced to personally choose which of her two young sons would be killed that night. She simply could not bring herself to actually make that impossible choice, and so the two men murdered the younger boy anyway, a small child named Jaehaerys, before quickly vanishing back out into the night. It was a genuine horror that the entire realm would not soon manage to forget, and it flowed directly, in an unbroken causal line, from the earlier death that had occurred above Storm's End. The terrible cycle of mutual vengeance was now fully and tragically complete on both sides of the conflict, one innocent child now dead within each respective family, and with that horrific balance achieved, any remaining possibility of a negotiated peace settlement had evaporated completely and permanently. Every single great lord throughout Westeros understood clearly and immediately what this development genuinely meant. The war would not possibly end now, until one entire house had been utterly and completely destroyed. Aemond had certainly never personally ordered the specific killing of young Jaehaerys, but he had, quite undeniably, personally lit the exact fuse that eventually led directly to it, and he understood that uncomfortable truth better than perhaps anyone else involved. Chapter 13: The Trap at Rook's Rest. The ongoing war continued, grinding steadily forward with a terrible momentum entirely its own. Aemond, now permanently branded publicly as the Kinslayer, gradually became convinced that only complete and total military victory could ever hope to silence the terrible name now permanently attached to him. He began carefully planning an elaborate ambush specifically intended to eliminate the Black's single most formidable remaining dragon rider, not Rhaenyra herself directly, but rather her fierce stepmother-turned ally, the battle-hardened Princess Rhaenys, rider of the notably swift dragon Meleys. The specific target chosen for this carefully planned trap was Rook's Rest, a relatively minor but genuinely strategically vital castle located along the coast of the Crownlands. If the Blacks chose to move in defense of it, Aemond correctly reasoned, they would inevitably be forced to commit their single most capable dragon to its active defense, and he fully intended to be personally waiting there when that moment finally arrived. King Aegon II would ride his own dragon Sunfire in first, deliberately drawing Rhaenys into open aerial engagement. Aemond, hidden carefully high above the concealing clouds atop Vhagar, would then strike decisively once the actual fighting had properly begun in earnest. Rhaenys answered the deliberate call exactly as Aemond had confidently predicted, flying in low over the coastline atop Meleys to actively defend the besieged castle below. She and Aegon clashed first in a brutal, remarkably evenly matched aerial duel across the gray morning sky, until Aemond finally descended suddenly from the concealing clouds like an entire falling mountain. Vhagar's sheer overwhelming mass rapidly overwhelmed Meleys within mere moments. The considerably smaller dragon and her experienced rider went down hard together, both killed instantly in the violent collision. But this particular victory came at a genuinely real and lasting cost. Aegon himself was thrown violently from Sunfire during the chaotic fighting, his own body badly shattered by the resulting fall, his dragon left grievously wounded as well. The king would ultimately survive his severe injuries, but he would never again be capable of riding a dragon, his once confident golden bearing now permanently reduced to little more than a broken, largely bedridden shell of his former self. Aemond himself emerged from the surrounding wreckage entirely unscathed, his distinctive silver eye patch catching the fading light of the dying battlefield fires below. With his own brother now completely incapacitated and no other green-aligned dragon currently capable of riding into further battle, the resulting shift in overall political power was immediate and unmistakable. The small council, led jointly by Alicent and Otto Hightower, turned collectively to the only capable man now remaining who could realistically hold the entire realm together during this crisis. Chapter 14: The Protector's Rule. Aemond was formally named Prince Regent and Protector of the realm. Rather than choosing to wear his own father's considerably simpler, more modest circlet, he deliberately selected instead the heavy, jagged crown of black steel and deep red rubies that had once belonged personally to Aegon the Conqueror himself. A calculated, entirely unmistakable statement directed at every lord and servant currently residing within the keep. He had not in his own mind become merely a temporary caretaker ruler. He fully intended from that moment forward to genuinely rule. His subsequent regency came to be defined primarily by ruthless efficiency rather than by any meaningful diplomacy. He doubled the city watch's regular patrols throughout King's Landing, executed suspected black sympathizers without granting them any formal trial whatsoever, thoroughly drained the royal treasury in order to pay for expensive mercenaries and much-needed new siege equipment, and flatly refused every single attempt at peaceful parley or negotiated truce, including one heartfelt plea from his own grieving mother urging him to seriously consider opening negotiations. He purged the surrounding crownlands of any remaining black loyalty using fire as his primary tool, burning entire towns and executing captured enemy knights, sending the severed heads of black-aligned soldiers back to their remaining allies as an unmistakable warning of what awaited continued resistance. He understood, quite correctly as it turned out, that genuine fear moves considerably faster than mere loyalty ever could, but the cumulative cost of instilling that fear mounted steadily and alarmingly with each passing day. Agricultural fields went entirely untended. The roads filled steadily with displaced refugees. Food stores within King's Landing itself began shrinking rapidly, as merchant ships stopped arriving altogether from ports too frightened of black raiders to risk the dangerous journey any longer. Even his own advisory council grew increasingly uneasy, repeatedly warning him that his ongoing campaign of calculated terror was actively alienating several great houses that might otherwise have remained comfortably neutral throughout the conflict. Aemond consistently dismissed all of this mounting caution as representing precisely the same kind of institutional weakness that had originally allowed Rhaenyra to successfully build her own army in the first place. Only Sir Criston Cole, now formally serving as Aemond's own hand and chief military advisor, could occasionally manage to temper his more genuinely reckless instincts during this period. though even Cole's typically careful counsel was increasingly ignored entirely in favor of swift, often brutally decisive independent action. Chapter 15: The Hunt for the Rogue Prince. For all of his considerable military victories, Aemond understood clearly that the true underlying heart of the entire war remained genuinely unresolved as long as one particular man remained stubbornly alive. His own uncle, Prince Aemond Targaryen, widely known as the Rogue Prince, a brilliant, thoroughly battle-hardened warrior and skilled rider of the fierce red dragon Caraxes, and the living, breathing embodiment of absolutely everything Aemond had come to genuinely hate about the entire Black Cause. Aemond had personally mocked him back when he was still just a child, and his continued survival made every single one of Aemond's hard-won military victories feel half hidden within the drifting evening mist. He found her there at last, an absolute mountain of ancient bronze scales and simmering fury curled up in the darkness like a small hill somehow granted the gift of breath. Her deep, rhythmic breathing alone was enough to visibly shake the very ground beneath his small feet. When her enormous golden eye finally opened and fixed itself directly on the small figure standing bravely before her, Aemond understood, with sudden and total clarity, that this represented easily the single most dangerous moment of his entire young life up to that point. Vhagar was no tame or docile creature by any stretch of the imagination. She was ancient beyond easy reckoning, genuinely wild, and had personally killed far more men across her long life than any other single living creature currently in all of Westeros. He did something that perhaps no sensible child should ever have dared attempt. He began speaking to her directly in High Valyrian, softly and hesitantly at first, then with steadily growing conviction and confidence, telling the ancient dragon that he was himself a true Targaryen, that he had come specifically to claim her as his own, and that he would personally prove himself entirely worthy of the great legacy she had once so proudly carried into battle on behalf of a queen. Vhagar rumbled low and deep somewhere within her massive chest. Her enormous head slowly lifted, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire surrounding landscape whole. Aemond reached out his small, open palm toward her. For one long, genuinely terrifying moment she simply stared back at him without moving. And then, quite slowly, she lowered her massive head and allowed the boy to gently touch her snout. It was in every meaningful sense an act of genuine acceptance, a bond formed not through any application of force, but through something far stranger, deeper, and more purely instinctive than that. Aemond climbed carefully onto her broad back, his small body utterly dwarfed by the towering ridges running along her ancient spine, gripped tightly onto the old leather harness that had once belonged to Lena herself, and Vhagar rose powerfully into the surrounding night sky. By the time dawn finally broke over Driftmark the following morning, news of what had happened had already spread through the entire castle like genuine wildfire. A mere 10-year-old boy had somehow managed to accomplish something that grown, experienced men and skilled riders alike had repeatedly failed to achieve for years on end. The Greens celebrated openly. The Blacks fumed privately. The delicate balance of power across all of Westeros had just shifted meaningfully overnight. And for Aemond personally, this remarkable triumph was also, tragically, about to become the very beginning of a lifelong curse. Chapter 5: The Price of a Dragon. His hard-won victory did not go entirely unanswered for very long at all. As Aemond climbed carefully down from Vhagar's massive back, still visibly shaking from both sheer exhaustion and the overwhelming adrenaline of what he had just accomplished, he discovered his cousins already waiting for him nearby, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey, Rhaenyra's own sons, who had personally watched the entire impossible scene unfold from the concealing shadows nearby. They were, understandably, absolutely furious. In their considered opinion, Vhagar had rightfully belonged to their own extended family. She had, after all, been ridden by their late mother's own cousin Lena, and now, infuriatingly, she had gone instead to a licensed son. What immediately followed was not any kind of formal duel or honorable contest between equals. It was instead a brutal, desperate, entirely undignified brawl between frightened children, fought out on the cold sand directly beneath the sleeping dragon's lair, salt spray hanging heavy in the night air, and the sea crashing rhythmically against the nearby rocks below. Aemond was somewhat older and considerably stronger than his younger cousins, but he was also badly outnumbered 3-1. Jacaerys struck the first blow, and Aemond fought back immediately with a fury that genuinely surprised even himself, briefly managing to pin the older boy firmly to the ground beneath him. But then Lucerys struck him hard from behind without warning. Joffrey quickly joined in as well, and the entire fight rapidly collapsed into a chaotic, swirling storm of flailing fists and desperate shouting. Aemond, now thoroughly cornered and badly outmatched, screamed a string of bitter insults at all three boys in High Valyrian, calling them bastards outright, throwing directly in their faces the specific accusation that everyone throughout the entire court routinely whispered privately: but that absolutely no one ever dared to say openly aloud. That their true biological father was already dead, and that none of them actually carried any genuine Targaryen blood in their veins at all. It was precisely within that violent chaos that Lucerys, not genuinely attempting to kill anyone, but rather desperately trying simply to make the escalating fighting stop entirely, reached out blindly and closed his small hand around the very first object he happened to find nearby, a small utility knife normally used only for cutting rope. It had certainly never been designed or intended as any kind of weapon, but it proved more than sharp enough regardless. Aemond never actually saw the blade coming toward him at all. He only felt it, a sudden, blinding, white-hot explosion of pain tearing violently across the entire right side of his young face. He screamed loudly in agony, but the sound itself was completely lost beneath the constant roar of the nearby sea. When the fighting finally ended, when the exhausted boys eventually managed to pull themselves apart from one another, gasping heavily for breath, Aemond's entire right eye was simply gone, a permanent, disfiguring wound carved forever into his young face by the trembling hand of his own first cousin. Chaos immediately spread throughout the entire castle. The whole assembled royal family was hastily summoned to the castle's great central chamber, known formally as the Hall of Nine, drawn there by the frantic screaming and the genuinely terrible news that spread rapidly from servant to servant. What followed inside that chamber resembled less a family gathering and more an impromptu, deeply hostile courtroom. Alicent demanded immediate and severe justice, insisting furiously that Lucerys be properly and visibly punished for what he had just done to her son. Rhaenyra absolutely refused to yield an inch, reminding the entire assembled court coldly that Aemond had personally called her own sons bastards, and had also deliberately defied the king's own explicit direct command by claiming Vhagar in the very first place her own sons, she insisted firmly, had merely been defending their own family honor against direct provocation. She asked pointedly, her voice icy with barely controlled anger, whether Alicent genuinely expected her to blind her own son in return as some kind of equivalent punishment. King Viserys himself, frail, exhausted, and utterly desperate to somehow preserve what little remained of the family's fragile peace, ultimately ordered the entire matter simply dropped without any formal punishment whatsoever. He commanded both sides of his fractured family to properly reconcile immediately and move forward together as one unified house. But the specific words that had already been spoken aloud within that particular hall could never truly be unspoken again, and the underlying damage done that night was already permanent, carved every bit as deeply into the family's shared future as the fresh scar now permanently carved into young Aemond's ruined face. Later that same night, someone quietly asked the injured boy whether he genuinely regretted what he had done, whether he perhaps now wished he had never climbed onto Vhagar's back at all, given everything it had already cost him. He looked up steadily with his single remaining eye and answered with quiet, unshakable simplicity. He had lost an eye, yes, but he had also gained himself a dragon. In that brief, quiet exchange, the boy who had once been merely a forgotten, overlooked second son began the slow process of becoming something else entirely. Chapter 6: The Sapphire Eye. The skilled Meisters of Driftmark worked steadily through the remainder of that long night to properly close the terrible wound, carefully stitching the torn eyelids shut and packing the resulting empty socket with honey-soaked linen strips in a determined effort to prevent any dangerous infection from setting in. But no available medicine could ever hope to restore what had been permanently lost that night, and no potion existed capable of easing the far deeper wound underneath. The cold, bitter humiliation of having been permanently maimed by a boy younger than himself, and then watching helplessly as his own father flatly refused to punish the child responsible in any meaningful way. For several difficult weeks afterward, Aemond lay slowly recovering within a private chamber of the Red Keep, his devoted mother rarely leaving his bedside for more than a few minutes at a time. When the protective bandages were finally removed for good and a polished mirror was carefully held up before his young face, he stared silently at what looked very much like a complete stranger, a pale, permanently puckered scar now sitting exactly where his eye had once been. He did not weep at the sight. He did not rage or shout. He simply asked quietly for a small piece of felt and some ordinary sewing thread, and in that unremarkable request, the eventual idea of the sapphire eye was first quietly born. A single cabochon sapphire, deep and dark as any storm-tossed sea, was eventually cut with great precision to the exact size of his missing eye, and carefully set into a thin silver backing fitted with a small hook capable of attaching securely behind his remaining eyelid. The very first time he wore it openly into the royal court, the entire room fell into a stunned, uncomfortable silence. The polished gem caught the flickering torchlight and seemed to genuinely glow with an eerie, almost living inner fire, lending his entire face a strange, otherworldly intensity that visibly unsettled even fully grown, battle-hardened knights. He was no longer simply a scarred, pitiable young prince. He had transformed himself, quite deliberately, into Aemond One-Eye, and the sapphire itself became his own personal answer to the wider world. Here is exactly what you took from me, now watch closely what I intend to become instead. He soon began wearing a distinctive silver eye patch directly over the gem as well, a curved crescent of carefully polished metal running smoothly from his temple down across his cheekbone. This was never merely a practical accessory. It quickly became a deliberate personal symbol, a calculated public announcement of the exact story lying behind it, and it noticeably changed the way the wider court began speaking about him from that point forward. Where he had once been casually dismissed as merely the bookish, overlooked second son, he was now discussed instead in noticeably quieter, more genuinely wary tones. The children of the court, Rhaenyra's own sons especially, began deliberately going out of their way to avoid him entirely whenever possible. It was during this same lengthy period of physical recovery that his martial training intensified dramatically beyond anything he had previously experienced. His father, perhaps motivated partly by his own lingering guilt, formally assigned Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, a man forged through hard experience in the harsh Dornish marches and utterly unwaveringly loyal to a licensed political faction, to serve as his personal dedicated swordmaster going forward. Cole proved to be cold, methodical, and entirely without patience for excuses of any kind. Under his exacting tutelage, Aemond rose well before dawn every single day and trained relentlessly until his hands genuinely bled, gradually learning to skillfully compensate for his permanently lost depth perception by sharply turning his head and carefully reading an opponent's shifting shoulders before their blade had even fully begun to move. When Aemond fell during training, Cole simply made him immediately get back up. When Aemond finally managed to land one solid, well-placed blow against him after countless failed attempts, Cole merely nodded once and quietly told him to do it again. Every single day, when Aemond caught his own reflection and saw the sapphire staring silently back at him, he thought immediately of Lucerys, the sudden shove, the blinding flash of pain, the mocking laughter that had echoed persistently in his memory ever since that night. That specific laughter gradually became a kind of private soundtrack that played over and over inside his mind throughout every single grueling training drill, and rather than eventually fading away with time as one might expect, his underlying hatred instead slowly crystallized into something considerably more dangerous and purposeful, a genuine motive, a clear personal purpose, a concrete reason to consistently push himself past the point of ordinary exhaustion. Sir Criston Cole, whether he ever fully realized it himself or not, was not simply training an ordinary young prince during those difficult years. He was, quite literally, forging a weapon. By the time he reached the age of 12, Aemond had already become a genuinely formidable physical presence, tall for his age, broad-shouldered from countless hours spent in the training yard, his every movement deliberate, economical, and precise. The quiet, bookish boy who had once spent his afternoons peacefully reading histories in the castle library was, for all practical purposes, entirely gone. In his place now stood a serious young man with a precious jewel in place of an eye, and increasingly with each passing year, a heart made largely of hardened flint. Chapter 7: The Scholar and the Sword. The traumatic loss of his eye did not slow Aemond down in the slightest. If anything at all, it served only to sharpen him further. While his older brother Aegon continued drinking and carousing his way through the capital's darker, less reputable corners, Aemond instead spent his own considerable free hours deep within the library of the Red Keep, methodically devouring detailed histories of the original Conquest, the crumbling ancient scrolls preserved from the old Valyrian freehold, and the specific military campaigns once waged so effectively by Aegon the Conqueror alongside his formidable dragon-riding sisters centuries earlier. He carefully memorized the complete lineage of nearly every single Targaryen who had ever lived, and he studied intently the recurring patterns found in both their greatest triumphs and their most notorious moments of madness. But he understood clearly that knowledge alone, however extensive, could never realistically command genuine respect within a world still fundamentally ruled by steel and open fire. So alongside his intensive studies, he also trained relentlessly and continuously, drilling repeatedly with the castle's master-at-arms until his own muscles literally screamed in protest, deliberately learning to effectively fight multiple opponents simultaneously, carefully studying imported fencing techniques from distant bravos, the heavy long axes traditionally favored in the north, and even the distinctive curved sabers regularly used by mounted Dothraki riders far across the narrow sea. He was never content merely to be adequately competent at these skills. He wanted, quite specifically, to become genuinely and reliably lethal. He turned seriously to philosophy as well during this period, reading carefully through the surviving works of respected scholars from distant Lies and Volantes, who had written extensively on the underlying nature of power and personal duty, and finding particular personal resonance in arguments suggesting that any effective ruler must be simultaneously both feared and respected by those beneath him, that simple compassion, entirely unaccompanied by genuine strength, ultimately amounted to little more than wasted effort. He gradually began to see himself less as a forgotten, overlooked second son and increasingly as the true and rightful heir to the original conqueror's actual legacy, a private belief that his own brother Aegon, openly sneering at his own crown while steadily drowning himself in wine, did absolutely nothing whatsoever to meaningfully discourage or challenge. This growing contrast between the two brothers came over time to genuinely define the entire Green faction throughout those difficult years. While the capital itself slowly drowned in the visible decadence of a failing, increasingly absent king's royal court, Aemond methodically built himself into something resembling a fortress of pure personal discipline. He gradually stopped attending most royal feasts entirely, unless they served some clear and specific strategic purpose. He spoke only rarely in public settings, and only when he genuinely had something worth saying to those present. And every single time he looked directly at his older brother, he saw quite clearly a royal crown resting squarely on entirely the wrong head, a private conclusion that emerged not from simple personal vanity, but rather from years spent carefully observing Aegon consistently shirk every meaningful royal duty, while Rhaenyra's own faction grew steadily bolder and more confident with each passing month. Word of this stark contrast gradually spread throughout the wider court. Some observers began saying that Aemond genuinely possessed the distinctive look of a true conqueror, deliberately comparing his striking silver hair and glowing sapphire eye to old surviving portraits of Meager the Cruel from generations past. Others noted instead his unusual cold patience, his apparent natural ability to accurately read an entire room or eventually, a full battlefield well before it had even finished fully forming around him. No one at court referred to him as merely a boy anymore. And yet, beneath all of this carefully cultivated discipline and hard-won skill, one particular wound had genuinely never healed at all. Every single time he caught an unexpected glimpse of his own reflection, the sapphire stared silently back at him, and the persistent memory of Lucerys Velaryon continued burning steadily in his chest like some stubborn ember that simply refused to ever fully cool down. He had successfully learned to channel that lingering rage productively into precision and discipline, but he had genuinely never forgot what had happened, and he had certainly never truly forgiven it either. He waited patiently, he planned carefully, and he remained privately certain that a day would eventually come when the dedicated scholar would finally close his many books and the carefully honed sword would at last taste real blood. Chapter 8: The Strong Toast. That particular day finally arrived during a great formal banquet held within the Red Keep in the year 127 AC. King Viserys, by then frail, exhausted, and thoroughly desperate, made one final determined attempt to properly mend the deep fracture already splitting his entire family in two, deliberately calling both rival factions together beneath one single roof, genuinely hoping that shared bread and wine might somehow remind everyone present that they still remained at least nominally one unified house. It was, as everyone quietly understood from the very start, essentially a carefully staged performance. The smiles exchanged were noticeably tight and forced, the polite laughter distinctly hollow, and the underlying tension between the two opposing sides of the family hung over the entire crowded hall like a single collectively held breath. It was ultimately Aemond himself who finally broke that fragile tension completely. Partway through the lengthy feast, he rose deliberately from his assigned seat, walked calmly to the very center of the hall and lifted his personal goblet high, not offering any toast whatsoever to his own father the king, but instead aiming his gesture directly and unmistakably at Rhaenyra's three assembled sons. "May your father be proud of you all," he announced clearly, pointedly calling them collectively three strong boys in front of the entire gathered court. The specific insult was surgically precise and instantly understood by absolutely everyone present. It represented a direct, public accusation that the three boys were not genuine Targaryens at all, but rather the illegitimate bastard sons of Sir Harwin Strong, spoken aloud publicly for the very first time in the family's long history. The entire hall immediately dissolved into complete chaos. Jackaries and Luceries both lunged furiously at Aemond simultaneously. Aegon rose quickly to physically defend his younger brother. Cups shattered loudly against the stone floor, plates went flying in every direction, and the carefully constructed peace that Viserys had so desperately hoped to build that evening collapsed entirely within moments, torn open completely in front of every single lord and lady who genuinely mattered within the realm. The king himself, his failing eyesight already largely gone along with the rest of his rapidly declining health, could only weakly cry out for order that absolutely no one present was inclined to actually heed. The deep family rift that had been quietly building for well over a decade beneath a carefully maintained veneer of proper courtly manners was now fully and permanently exposed for all to see, and it could genuinely never be sealed shut again afterward. War, from that specific night forward, was no longer merely a distant possibility being carefully managed by cautious diplomats. It had become, quite simply, only a matter of time. Viserys' already fragile health, which had been steadily declining for years by that point, seemed to accelerate its decline even faster following that disastrous night. He retreated increasingly into his own private chambers, attended only by his personal maesters and his devoted wife Alicent, while both rival factions quietly began moving their respective pieces carefully into position for the inevitable conflict that everyone involved now clearly understood was rapidly approaching. Chapter 9: The Green Council's Gambit. In the early months of the year 129 AC, King Viserys I Targaryen finally died quietly in the night after a long and difficult illness. According to surviving accounts from the Black faction, he had. Tonight we travel back into the dark and bloody history of House Targaryen, into the life of a boy who was born a spare, mocked as a child, and who rose through grief, fire, and vengeance to become one of the most feared men in the history of Westeros. This is the story of Aemond Targaryen, the second son of a dying king, the rider of the largest dragon the world had ever known, the protector of the realm who wore a crown he was never meant to wear, and the man history remembers above all else by a single terrible word: Kinslayer. Let us begin at the beginning, in the year 110 after the conquest of Aegon the Dragon, inside the torchlit stone halls of the Red Keep, where a family already quietly dividing itself in two welcomed a child who would, in time, set the whole realm on fire. Chapter 1: The Spare. A child was born into King's Landing in 110 AC, the third child and second son of King Viserys I Targaryen and his second wife, Queen Alicent Hightower. They named him Aemond, an old and proud Targaryen name fit for any prince of the dragon's blood. And yet from the very hour of his birth, his place within the family was already fixed by circumstance rather than by anything he himself had done or could do. He was not the firstborn son. That title belonged to his older brother, Aegon, a boy who would grow up indulged at every turn, his flaws excused before they were even finished being committed. He was not the named heir to the Iron Throne. That extraordinary honor belonged to his half-sister Rhaenyra, the king's daughter by his first marriage, chosen over every possible male claimant in a decision that would eventually tear the realm in half. And he was not the gentle, strange, dreamlike child who won the court's affection effortlessly. That was his younger sister Helaena, who drifted through the gardens chasing insects while the family plotted quietly around her. Aemond was, in the truest and cruelest sense of the word, the spare. In a dynasty utterly obsessed with succession, bloodlines, and the divine right they believed ran through their Valyrian blood, a second son existed largely as insurance, useful only if some misfortune befell the heir standing ahead of him in line. He grew up watching his older brother receive forgiveness for behavior that would have earned any other child a beating, and watching his half-sister carry the full weight, privilege, and gravity of being their father's chosen successor. Meanwhile, Aemond stood quietly in the margins of every important room, watching, listening, absorbing, and slowly beginning to burn with a resentment that, for years, had nowhere at all to go. The wound cut far deeper than mere politics or precedence. In House Targaryen, a child's value was often measured before they could even speak, through a single quiet ritual. Whether a dragon's egg had been placed in their cradle at birth, a promise sometimes fulfilled, sometimes not, of the divine legacy the family believed coursed through their veins. Aegon had received his cradle egg. Helaena had received hers. Even Rhaenyra's sons, whose true parentage was whispered about in every dark corner of the court, had eggs and young dragons of their own by the time they were old enough to walk the training yards. Aemond had nothing. No egg had been laid beside him in his cradle. It was an omission the family barely acknowledged at the time, treating it as an unfortunate accident of timing, but Aemond never once forgot it. Every time he watched a cousin bond with a hatchling, every time he watched his brother stroll past with an ease and confidence he had done absolutely nothing himself to earn, that early absence gnawed at him a little further, deepening a hollow place inside him that he would spend the rest of his life trying, in increasingly violent ways, to fill. King Viserys, worn thin by decades spent trying to keep an uneasy peace between his ambitious wife and his headstrong named heir, had little emotional energy left over for the inner life of his quiet middle son. Queen Alicent, for her part, poured nearly all of her hope, her ambition, and her fear into Aegon, grooming him relentlessly for a crown he seemed to want less with every passing year, while treating Aemond as something closer to an instrument, a blade she intended to sharpen rather than a child she intended to comfort. And so Aemond, denied warmth from either parent in any consistent way, turned inward. He read constantly. He watched everyone around him with a careful, patient attention few adults noticed in a boy so young. He listened to every conversation that drifted through his mother's private solar, memorizing names, alliances, grudges, and slights the way other children his age memorized nursery rhymes and prayers. Long before anyone at court thought to take real notice of him, he was already quietly building something inside himself, a foundation of discipline and grievance that would, in time, prove impossible to dismantle. Chapter 2: The Height or Influence. To understand what Aemond eventually became, it is essential first to understand the woman who shaped him more than any other single person in his life: his mother, Queen Alicent. Alicent had grown up far from the intrigues of King's Landing in Oldtown, the ancient seat of the Faith of the Seven and the intellectual and spiritual heart of Andal culture across Westeros. Her father, Otto Hightower, served for years as Hand of the King, and he raised his daughter with a deep and unshakable reverence for tradition, for order, and for the belief that the laws of gods and men, as they had been recorded for centuries in the sacred texts of the faith, were not things to be casually cast aside for the sake of convenience or ambition. When she first came to court at the age of only 15, sent to comfort a grieving king after the death of his first wife, she carried those values with her into every room she entered, and she never once set them down. The Targaryens, in stark contrast, had descended from old Valyria, a civilization built upon dragonfire, blood magic, incestuous royal marriage meant to preserve the purity of their line, and an unwavering belief in their own inherent superiority over every other family in the known world. To a devout woman raised within the strict moral framework of the faith, this was not merely a foreign custom to be politely tolerated. It bordered, in her private convictions, on outright sin. So when King Viserys made the extraordinary decision to name his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir over his own trueborn son Aegon, breaking with centuries of tradition that had always favored male succession over female, Alicent read the decision as confirmation of everything she had long feared: that Valyrian arrogance, left unchecked, was going to tear apart the very traditional order that had kept the realm stable for generations. She taught these convictions to her children constantly, weaving them into bedtime stories, quiet lessons delivered inside the sept, and whispered warnings shared over supper about the dangers of unchecked pride and Valyrian exceptionalism, where Aegon dismissed nearly everything his mother said with a careless shrug. More interested in wine and idle amusement than in any lesson about duty, Aemond absorbed every single word with a hunger that occasionally surprised even Alicent herself. He asked sharp, pointed, uncomfortable questions. Why had Rhaenyra been chosen as heir when Aegon was older? Did their father not understand that Rhaenyra's own sons were widely rumored not to carry true Targaryen blood at all? How could the great lords of Westeros ever be expected to bend the knee to a woman sitting the Iron Throne when centuries of tradition said otherwise? Alicent would answer him patiently each time, her voice calm even as her eyes burned with quiet conviction, explaining that the realm was a fragile structure held together by rules tested across 1,000 years of history, and that breaking those rules, however tempting it might seem in the moment, would eventually break the realm itself along with them. It was in these private, unhurried conversations, long before any formal political alliance had taken visible shape, that what history would later call the Green Faction first began to quietly form. Lord Larys Strong, the realm's master of whisperers, would visit the Queen's solar bearing careful reports on Rhaenyra's movements and the shifting loyalties of various lords. Sir Criston Cole, the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, would stand near the door during these meetings, his own resentment toward Rhaenyra's favored champions simmering just beneath a carefully disciplined exterior. And tucked quietly in the corner of the room, young Aemond sat listening to every word, memorizing every name mentioned, watching closely as his mother wielded genuine influence not through steel or dragonfire, but through patience, calculated favor, and the slow, careful cultivation of personal loyalty. It was in many ways his very first real education in the deadly game of politics that would eventually consume his entire life, and it was a lesson he never once forgot. Meanwhile, the contrast between the two Hytwara's sons only deepened with each passing year. Aegon chased wine, women, and the easy, meaningless laughter found in the capital's rowdier taverns, sneering openly at his lessons and treating the very idea of one day becoming king as little more than a tedious inconvenience to be avoided whenever possible. Aemond, by stark contrast, threw himself into both study and physical training with an intensity that genuinely startled even the castle's hardened master-at-arms. He rose well before dawn each morning to drill relentlessly with sword and shield. He read deep into the night, working steadily through histories of old Valyria and detailed accounts of the military campaigns waged by Aegon the Conqueror and his dragon-riding sisters centuries earlier. He spent long, quiet hours near the dragon pit, simply watching the great beasts housed there with something close to genuine reverence. Where Aegon was soft and easily distracted, Aemond was steel, sharpened daily. Where Aegon was careless and indifferent to consequence, Aemond was calculating, weighing every action against some larger purpose only he could see clearly. And though the court still whispered, out of long habit, that the crown rightfully belonged to the elder son by simple tradition, it was increasingly the younger brother who quietly drew the attention and grudging respect of those lords who valued genuine strength and discipline over an accident of birth order. Lysant watched all of this unfold with a complicated and uneasy mixture of pride and growing concern. She saw reflected in Aemond nearly everything she had once quietly hoped Aegon might eventually become: disciplined, dutiful, deeply loyal to both his family and the faith that had shaped her own upbringing. But she also saw something else taking root in her second son, something considerably more dangerous, a hunger that no amount of lessons or discipline alone could ever fully satisfy. He wanted, quite badly, to prove himself as something far greater than merely a prince, and in a family whose entire greatness was measured in dragonfire and conquest, she understood with growing unease exactly where a hunger like that would eventually lead him. The specific seeds of the burning hatred that would come to define Aemond's later life had not yet been fully planted. That particular cruelty was still waiting several years in his future. But the soil beneath him had already been carefully tilled by years of quiet resentment, rivalry, and neglect, waiting patiently for nothing more than a single spark to set it fully alight. Chapter 3: The Pink Dread. That spark arrived in the form of a childhood cruelty so small, so casually petty, that it seems almost absurd when placed beside everything it would eventually set in motion. History would come to remember it half-mockingly as the incident of the Pink Dread. By the time Aemond had reached 7 or 8 years of age, he understood with painful clarity exactly where he stood within the complicated pecking order of the Red Keep. He was the youngest of the 3 true-born sons of King Viserys, the least noticed of the group by a wide margin, and crucially the only member of his entire generation still without a dragon of his own to call. His older brother Aegon already had his dragon, Sunfyre, a creature widely admired for its breathtaking golden beauty. Rhaenyra's sons, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey, though younger in age than Aegon, were nonetheless older than Aemond, and each of them already possessed his own young dragon as well, Vermax, Arax, and Tyraxes respectively. They rode these young dragons with the easy, entirely unearned confidence that comes naturally to children who have never once known genuine doubt about their own place in the world. Aemond alone remained dragonless, a true prince of the royal blood who could not accomplish the single defining thing that, in the eyes of the entire realm, made someone truly Targaryen. Children, as any honest observer of childhood cruelty knows, rarely require an elaborate scheme to be genuinely cruel to one another. Boredom alone is very often sufficient. And so it happened on an entirely ordinary afternoon within the cool stone corridors of the Red Keep, that Aegon, together with Jacaerys and Lucerys, discovered a squealing piglet wandering loose from the castle kitchens. They wrapped the poor animal in a rough length of cloth meant to resemble a proper saddle blanket, and with mocking, exaggerated ceremony, they presented the terrified creature to Aemond as a generous gift. His very own dragon at last, since he had so conspicuously failed to claim a real one for himself. They named their cruel little joke the Pink Dread, a deliberate, pointed mockery of the legendary dragon names carried by House Targaryen throughout its long history, names like Balerion the Black Dread. To christen a common pig with such a title was to declare, plainly and publicly, that Aemond simply wasn't worthy of a real dragon at all. Jacaerys and Lucerys both laughed loudly at their own joke. Lucerys, the youngest of Rhaenyra's 3 sons, laughed loudest and longest of anyone present. Aemond stood perfectly still throughout the entire humiliating display, his face burning with shame, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He did not cry, He did not run off in search of his mother's comfort. He simply swallowed the humiliation whole, the way one might swallow a stone dropped into still water, and quietly made himself a private vow that would go on to echo through the entire remainder of his life. That prank was never really about a pig at all. It was, in every meaningful sense, a formal declaration that Rhaenyra's sons, and even his own brother, genuinely viewed him as an outsider within his own family, a figure fit only for casual ridicule. From that particular day forward, Aemond did not simply dislike his cousins in the ordinary way that siblings and cousins often dislike one another. He began, quietly and deliberately, to hate them, and the deepest and most concentrated portion of that hatred settled permanently upon Lucerys Velaryon, the boy who had laughed the loudest of all. Alicent, sensing her son's wounded pride even though he never spoke of the incident directly, tried gently to soothe him, telling him repeatedly that a proper dragon would surely come to him eventually, that the strongest and oldest dragons often chose their eventual riders only once those riders had truly proven themselves ready. Aemond was not soothed by any of this. He was finished, entirely and permanently, with simply waiting for things to be given to him. The specific humiliation of the pink dread became something like a slow, persistent fever that drove him to study obsessively the histories of every great dragon that had ever flown over Westeros, to carefully memorize the known locations of wild, riderless beasts scattered across the realm, and to train in the yard with an intensity that genuinely startled even his most seasoned instructors. The sensitive, somewhat lonely boy who had once quietly sought his mother's simple approval began, slowly and steadily, to harden into someone else entirely, someone considerably colder, someone far more calculating, someone absolutely determined never again to be mocked by anyone. He waited patiently, he planned carefully, and an opportunity, though he had no way of knowing it yet, was already approaching from the horizon, arriving, as such opportunities so often do, wrapped tightly in the unexpected clothing of family grief. Chapter 4: Driftmark. In the year 120 AC, the entire royal family gathered together at the ancient Velaryon stronghold of High Tide on the windswept island of Driftmark, summoned there for a solemn funeral. Lena Velaryon, beloved wife of Prince Aemond Targaryen, and herself the accomplished rider of the great and ancient dragon Vhagar, had died tragically in childbirth, her body finally failing her after an unusually long and difficult labor. She was still only in her 20s at the time of her death. Funerals held within the Seven Kingdoms are rarely ever simple, straightforward affairs. They tend instead to become elaborate gatherings of power, shifting alliances, and old wounds that had never quite finished healing properly, and this particular funeral proved to be no exception whatsoever. King Viserys formally decreed that the entire extended royal family must attend in order to properly honor House Velaryon, a decision that inevitably forced the two increasingly hostile branches of his own bloodline, the Greens loyal to Alicent's children, and the Blacks loyal firmly to Rhaenyra, into sharing the exact same halls, the exact same chambers, and the exact same long, uncomfortable nights of formal mourning. From the very moment their respective ships first docked at Driftmark's harbor, the tension hanging in the salt-heavy air was every bit as thick and suffocating as the sea fog that regularly rolled in off the surrounding waters. Alicent arrived at the head of her own procession dressed in flowing green and polished silver, every careful step she took serving as a silent but entirely unmistakable public statement of her family's claim to the throne. Across the busy courtyard, Rhaenyra arrived at the side of her grieving husband Daemon, their combined retinue dressed uniformly in solemn black and deep red, their faces carved from something that looked very much like stone. Between the two rival processions, the children of both families eyed one another warily from a careful distance, Aegon smirking faintly in a way that never quite reached his own eyes, Helena murmuring quiet, half-formed words that only she herself seemed able to understand, and Aemond, only 10 years old at the time, standing entirely apart from the rest of them, his full attention fixed intently on something far beyond the immediate stone walls of Driftmark itself. He had, of course, already heard the relevant whispers circulating through the assembled court. Lena Velaryon had ridden Vhagar, the single oldest and largest dragon still living anywhere in the known world, the very same magnificent beast that had once carried Queen Visenya Targaryen personally into battle, and that had helped burn the infamous Field of Fire during the original War of Conquest itself. And now, with her devoted rider suddenly and tragically dead, Vhagar had no one left to fly her. She was, for the first time in decades, entirely riderless, resting somewhere along the rugged, windswept cliffs of Driftmark, alone and presumably grieving in whatever complicated way dragons are capable of experiencing grief. For years now, Aemond had been consistently and painfully denied a dragon of his own. His cradle egg had simply never hatched at all, Every subsequent attempt he had quietly made to claim some other young hatchling had ended, every single time in frustrating failure. He had watched sibling after sibling, cousin after cousin, successfully bond with dragons of their very own while he himself remained permanently grounded and powerless, a prince of the blood in name only. But here, on genuinely neutral ground, within the ancient ancestral seat of House Velaryon itself, the single largest and most fearsome dragon anywhere in the known world currently had absolutely no rider at all, and King Viserys, weak from illness and thoroughly unwilling to inflame the already simmering tensions any further than necessary, had explicitly and directly forbidden any of the assembled children from even attempting to claim her for themselves. Aemond simply chose to ignore that explicit royal command entirely. On the night immediately following the completion of the formal funeral rites, once the castle's many torches had finally burned low and high tide itself had settled into an uneasy, exhausted quiet, Aemond quietly slipped away from his assigned chambers completely alone. He told absolutely no one where he intended to go. He carried no weapon of any kind and wore no armor whatsoever, only the thin clothes already on his back and a fierce, private determination that simply would not be denied any longer. He made his careful way along the rocky cliffs where Vhagar had reportedly been resting, her enormous form still.